The world today is experiencing not a crisis, not turbulence, and not just another historical cycle. It is going through a tectonic shift, one that is not happening in news headlines or IMF reports. It is happening where those in power have always been most afraid, on the streets, in people's minds, and in the feelings of millions who have suddenly realized the same thing at once. The old rules no longer work. This process did not start in any one specific place and has no single headquarters, command center, or ideological core. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous for the existing elites. Because while a revolution can be led, negotiated with, bought off, or suppressed, the internal rejection of the system's legitimacy by millions of people cannot. In Nepal, the government was forced to step down under pressure from the streets. In Madagascar, the president lost control over the country. In Morocco, young people who grew up in the era of smartphones and total access to information have stopped viewing the state as something sacred and untouchable. In Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Iran, the protests have taken on a form that can no longer be explained by local causes. This is not about prices, not about elections, and not about specific laws. This is about the erasure of trust. From Kenya to Mexico, from Indonesia to Turkey, from the Balkans to Latin America, the same scenario is repeated, but without a scriptwriter. Young people are not coming out for slogans. They are coming out because they no longer see a future within the existing order. This is not a protest of hope, it is a protest of emptiness. And here is where the most important turning point occurs. When the government falls in one country, it's called instability. When dozens fall, it's called a global crisis. But when, at the same time, in dozens of countries, people stop fearing the authorities, this is no longer a crisis. It's the end of the old social contract. The old contract was simple. You obey. We provide minimal stability. You stay silent. We guarantee your survival. You don't ask unnecessary questions. We give you the illusion of a future. This contract existed for decades, and in some countries, for centuries. But today, it has been broken. Iran is not the source of this disease. Iran is its symptom, the most vivid, the harshest, the most dramatic. In 2022, the death of a young woman became a trigger, but not the cause. The cause had been building up for decades. Women were the first to take to the streets, not because they were weak, but because the system displayed its violence most openly through them. The regime responded with repression, as it always had. But something happened that they did not expect. Fear stopped working. People began to do things they had previously been afraid to even think about. They stopped seeing the state as something all-powerful, and that is deadly dangerous for any authoritarian regime. For decades, the Islamic Republic was held together by ideology and fear, but the ideology lost its value and the fear evaporated. When this happens, the regime may still exist physically, but politically, it is already dead. The Iranian authorities understood this. As early as 2025, officials began openly referring to the Zoomer generation as an internal threat that needed to be neutralized. This is a rare moment of honesty because they admitted the main thing. The new generation no longer believes in the myths of the past. Zoomers aren't buying the revolutionary fairy tales from 40 years ago. For them, it's not a sacred story, but an outdated narrative that has nothing to do with reality. And when young people stop believing, television ceases to be a weapon, and the security forces are no longer a guarantee of control. But it's important to understand that today, people are taking to the streets not for some abstract idea of freedom. They're coming out because basic life has become impossible. Iran's economy has been destroyed to such an extent that the national currency has become a mockery of the very concept of money. There was a time when you could get 30,000 rials for $1, and today it's almost 1.5 million. This isn't inflation, it's financial collapse. It's the moment when money stops fulfilling its main function, being a store of value. Imagine an entrepreneur who can't set a price tag because he doesn't know if he'll be able to restock his goods tomorrow. Imagine salaries equivalent to $200 a month, while rent has increased by almost half in a year. This isn't an economy, it's an equation with no solution. And it's precisely at such moments that people start looking for alternatives. Not political ones, but existential ones. When the national currency burns up, people turn to gold and Bitcoin, because gold can be hidden, and Bitcoin can be carried in your head by memorizing 12 words. In Iran, this is no longer about technology or innovation, it's a means of survival. And this is a warning for all other countries. Because when national currencies lose trust, it's not just the economy that collapses. The very structure of power falls apart. The Grand Bazaar in Tehran goes on strike, shops close, and trade comes to a halt. Not because people are lazy, but because working under such conditions means guaranteed bankruptcy. On top of that comes economic collapse. Years of drought have dried up the reservoirs. The authorities are seriously discussing evacuating the capital. Millions of people could be left without water. This is no longer politics, this is biology. And against this backdrop, young people see the state spending billions of dollars on foreign adventures instead of saving their own country. And it's no longer possible to hide this because everyone has a device in their pocket that shows an alternative reality. Iranian censorship is powerless against the smartphone. The internet can be slowed down, but it can't be erased from people's minds. And when the state can no longer offer prosperity, dignity, or hope, repression becomes an accelerator of collapse. But let's take a broader look. These uprisings around the world have no common ideology, no leaders, and no center. And that's exactly what scares the elites the most, because you can't negotiate with this. In one country, the spark was morality. In another, the price of the subway. In a third, attacks on messengers. And in a fourth, environmental restrictions. But everywhere the result is the same, a rejection of the old order. This isn't a global revolution following a manual, it's a complete collapse of trust. People no longer believe a single word coming from above. And this distrust spreads to everything: politics, money, institutions, and promises. That's exactly why interest in cryptocurrencies, hard assets, and alternative systems is growing. Because when power loses legitimacy, fiat money loses all meaning. From 2010 to 2020, there were nearly 7,000 major protests in more than 150 countries. And this isn't the peak, it's only the beginning. Because even in stable democracies, the level of trust in the state has fallen below 50%. Less than 40% of people on the planet trust their governments. This is unprecedented. This means that the majority live in a state of forced submission, not voluntary consent. And this is where we return to the word legitimacy. This is the key concept of the 21st century, because power without legitimacy can exist only by means of force, and force is a finite resource. The Zoomer generation has become the catalyst for this process, not because they are aggressive or radical, but because they are the first generation to grow up with the global internet in their pocket. They see the world as a whole, they spot lies instantly. Since childhood, they were told that they would live worse than their parents. And they accepted this as a sentence. But in 2026, they said no, because the system's main promise was broken. The social elevator is broken. Honest work no longer guarantees a decent life. And when the rules stop working, people stop following them. Here it's important to understand one more thing that many people overlook. This gap between the authorities and society is not the result of a single mistake or a single crisis. It's a cumulative effect, the result of endlessly pushing problems into the future, a future that has now arrived. Financial bubbles that had been inflating for years. Debts that were considered manageable as long as interest rates were almost zero. Social promises that no one ever intended to keep because they thought they'd deal with it later somehow. Environmental costs that were ignored because not now. All of this came together at a single point in time. And that moment coincided with a generation reaching adulthood, a generation unburdened by illusions, a generation that doesn't remember a world without crises. For them, instability is the norm, not the exception. And that's exactly why threats of chaos don't scare them. They grew up in it. For the elites, chaos is a catastrophe, but for Zoomers, it's just the usual environment. And that's the fundamental difference in worldviews. That's why we see fear changing sides. Before, it was the people who were afraid, but today it's the authorities who are scared. They're not afraid of a specific protest, but of the very fact that they can no longer control public sentiment. They're afraid that they don't understand the language of the new generation. They're afraid that they can't offer a clear vision of the future. And without a vision of the future, power turns into an administration for managing the past. It can appeal to traditions, to history, to past victories. But this works less and less because the past doesn't feed you, doesn't provide housing, and doesn't protect you from tomorrow's risks. And here we come to the most unpleasant conclusion for any system. Legitimacy cannot be restored by force, it can't be printed, it can't be imposed. It either exists or it doesn't. And when it disappears, a slow but unstoppable process of decay begins. This decay doesn't necessarily look like a revolution with barricades. Most often, it looks like a leak, a brain drain, a capital drain, a loss of trust, and a drain of energy. A country may formally exist, but be empty inside. People stop investing, stop making plans, stop tying their fate to this place. They live as if temporarily, even if they haven't gone anywhere. And this is perhaps the most destructive scenario of all, because the system can be reformed when people still believe in it. A crisis can be survived when there is hope. But when a society has internally emigrated, it can no longer be held together by decrees or laws. History has shown time and again, the most sweeping changes begin not with programs and manifestos, but with the loss of faith. When people stop believing, they start searching, and in that search, new rules are born. The question now is not whether this process will stop. It has already begun. The question is who will be able to guide it, and who will try to suppress it.